Gib du jetzt deine Stimme ab. Wenn ja, dann tritt für mich ein, so wie ich für dich eingetreten bin.
What happened to the family of the most infamous man in history? When the world remembers Adolf Hitler, it rarely wonders, what became of those who shared his blood? The story begins in the final desperate days of World War II. As Berlin burned and the Third Reich disintegrated, Adolf Hitler, the architect of destruction, vanished. The 1,000-year empire he had promised lay in ruins. The world moved forward, but what became of those he left behind? The Hitler family was never a happy one. The household in which he grew up was a place of fear, control, and violence. Adolf's father, Alois Hitler, was a customs official known throughout their small Austrian town for his volatile temper and iron-fisted rule. He was a man who believed in strict discipline, administered through both psychological manipulation and physical brutality. Their mother, Clara, tried to provide some warmth in the cold household, but she was often powerless against her husband's tyranny. She doted on Adolf especially, perhaps seeing in him some hope for redemption, or perhaps simply trying to protect him from his father's worst impulses. But her affection couldn't shield her children from the scars that would mark them all. Of Clara's 6 children, only 2 survived to adulthood alongside Adolf. His half-sister Angela, born in 1883 from Alois's previous marriage, and his full sister Paula, born in 1896. The other siblings died in childhood, victims of disease and the harsh realities of late 19th century rural life. But survival didn't mean escape. The violence of their childhood home followed all the Hitler children into adulthood. Paula would later recall with bitter clarity one of her earliest memories. She was only 8 years old when Adolf, already showing the cruelty that would define his later years, struck her across the face. "Once again, I feel my brother's loose hand across my face," she said decades later, the pain still fresh in her voice. This was the family that produced Adolf Hitler, not a lineage of greatness or genius, but a broken household built on fear and violence. And when Adolf rose to power, dragging the world into the abyss with him, these same siblings would find themselves trapped by association with a man they had never fully understood and could never escape. Paula Hitler was born into obscurity in 1896, and she spent her entire life trying to return to it. As the youngest of the Hitler children and Adolf's only full sister, she was perhaps the one who understood him best, or at least the one who had known him longest. But understanding Adolf Hitler didn't mean supporting him. It meant living in constant fear of what he had become. In her early years, Paula was a quiet, unremarkable girl. She wasn't particularly political or ambitious. She simply wanted what most young women of her era wanted: a decent job, perhaps marriage, maybe children, a normal life. But normalcy was something that would forever elude her. When Adolf began his rise through Germany's political ranks in the 1920s and early 1930s, Paula kept her distance. She didn't attend his rallies. She didn't join the Nazi Party. She didn't bask in the reflected glory of her brother's ascent. Instead, she took a job as a secretary at an insurance company in Vienna, using her modest salary to live a simple, anonymous life. But anonymity proved impossible. When her employer discovered who she really was, that Paula Wolf, the quiet secretary in the corner office, was actually Paula Hitler, sister of the Führer, she was immediately fired. The reason given was vague, something about potential complications. But Paula understood the real message. Even in Nazi Austria, where Adolf's portrait hung in every office and his name was spoken with reverence, being his sister was a liability. Adolf, to his credit, didn't abandon her entirely. He sent her money periodically, ensuring she wouldn't starve. In 1939, he invited her to visit the Berghof, his massive mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps. It was a summons more than an invitation, and Paula accepted with trepidation. The visit was brief and deeply uncomfortable. Paula found herself surrounded by SS officers, party officials, and her brother's inner circle, all of whom looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. She was family, yes, but she was also an outsider, someone who hadn't earned her place in this world of power and pageantry. The atmosphere at the Berghof was thick with tension, arrogance, and barely concealed contempt for anyone deemed weak or unworthy. Adolf himself was distant. He spoke to her briefly, asked perfunctory questions about her health and living situation, then dismissed her to return to his war planning. Paula left the mountain fortress feeling more alone than ever. She returned to Vienna and withdrew even deeper into her solitary existence, hoping that the coming war would somehow pass her by. It didn't. When the war ended in May 1945, with Germany shattered and Adolf dead by his own hand in a Berlin bunker, Paula's world collapsed. American forces swept through Austria, hunting for Nazis, collaborators, and anyone connected to the regime. Paula's name was on their list. On May 26, 1945, American intelligence agents found her hiding in a small village outside Vienna. They detained her immediately, convinced that as Hitler's sister, she must know something valuable. Perhaps she knew where Nazi gold was hidden, or the location of fleeing war criminals, or details about the regime's inner workings. Surely the Führer's own sister couldn't have been completely ignorant. The interrogation lasted for hours. American agents pressed her relentlessly, asking about Adolf's plans, his personality, his final days, his crimes. But Paula maintained the same story throughout, a story she would repeat for the rest of her life. "I knew nothing," she insisted. "I lived in the depths of the countryside, isolated from everything. I only knew what the papers said. The Americans were skeptical. How could Hitler's own sister not know about the concentration camps, the mass murder of Jews, the systematic extermination of millions? But they could find no evidence to contradict her claims. No documents linked her to the regime. No witnesses placed her at party functions or meetings. Paula had been exactly what she claimed, a peripheral figure, connected by blood but not by ideology or action. Eventually they released her. But freedom came at a cost. Paula was now penniless, unemployed, and forever marked by her surname. She couldn't return to Vienna, where too many people knew who she was. She couldn't seek work, because no one would hire Hitler's sister. She subsisted on meager state support and what little remained of her inheritance, living day to day in a world that had no place for her. In 1952, 7 years after the war's end, Paula made a decision that would define her remaining years. She adopted a false name, Paula Wolf. The choice of surname was eerie, unsettling, perhaps even subconscious. Wolf had been Adolf's favorite pseudonym for years. He had used it in the 1920s when he needed to travel incognito. His mountain retreat was called the Berghof, but his inner circle sometimes referred to it as the Wolf's Lair. He had named his military headquarters Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair. The wolf was his totem, his symbol of strength and cunning. Did Paula choose this name as a tribute to her dead brother? An ironic commentary on her situation? Or did it simply surface from some deep psychological well, a connection to Adolf that she couldn't sever even when trying to hide? We'll never know. Paula never explained her reasoning, and no one dared ask. As Paula Wolf, she rented a small apartment near Berchtesgaden, the same area where the Berghof had once stood. The massive compound had been destroyed by Allied bombing, but the mountain landscape remained, beautiful and indifferent to the horrors that had unfolded there. Strange stories circulated about Paula's life during these years. Some claimed that former SS men, still loyal to Adolf's memory, watched over her from a distance. They supposedly helped her with errands, brought her groceries, and shielded her from journalists and curiosity seekers. Whether this was protection, surveillance, or simply the delusion of a lonely woman is unclear. But Paula lived in profound solitude, speaking to almost no one, venturing out rarely, existing in a liminal space between the past she couldn't escape and a future she couldn't build. For nearly 15 years, Paula maintained absolute silence about her brother and her past. She gave no interviews, wrote no memoir, and refused all contact with journalists and historians. But in 1959, 1 year before her death, she finally agreed to speak. A British television documentary crew had tracked her down and made her an offer. They wanted to hear her side of the story, to understand what it was like being Adolf Hitler's sister. Perhaps they hoped for a revelation, a confession, or at least some acknowledgement of the enormity of what had happened. What they got instead disturbed viewers across Britain and beyond. Paula appeared on camera as a frail, elderly woman, her face lined with age and hardship. She spoke in soft, halting German, translated for English audiences. The interviewer asked gentle questions at first, probing her childhood, her relationship with Adolf as a young man, her memories of their parents. Paula offered vague recollections. She remembered Adolf as sometimes cruel, sometimes kind, always unpredictable. She remembered their mother's warmth and their father's rage. She painted a picture of an unhappy household, but nothing exceptional, nothing that seemed to foreshadow genocide. Then came the inevitable question: what did you know about the Holocaust? Paula's response was chilling in its blankness. "I knew nothing," she repeated, just as she had told the American interrogators 14 years earlier. "I was far removed from everything. I heard only what others heard." The interviewer pressed gently. But surely she must have heard something. The camps? The deportations? The millions of dead? Paula's face remained impassive. She offered no condemnation of Adolf. She expressed no sorrow for his victims. She simply repeated her mantra of ignorance, as if saying it enough times would make it true, or at least make the question stop. The interview left viewers profoundly unsettled. Was Paula lying? Was she genuinely ignorant, having somehow missed the greatest crime of the century, despite her connection to its architect? Or had she constructed a psychological wall so complete that she could no longer access the truth, even if she wanted to? We'll never know. A year after that interview, on June 1st, 1960, Paula Hitler died alone in her apartment of a heart attack. She was 64 years old. Paula was buried in a simple grave in Berchtesgaden, marked with a plain headstone bearing her real name, Paula Hitler. There was no funeral of note. No family came to mourn her because there was no family left. No friends attended because she had made none. She was lowered into the ground as anonymously as she had lived. But even that small acknowledgement couldn't last. In 2005, 45 years after her death, local authorities made a quiet decision. Paula's remains were exhumed from her marked grave and reburied under a new, completely anonymous headstone. The location of her new resting place was not publicized. Her name was scrubbed from the cemetery records. Paula Hitler, the last person to legally bear the Hitler surname, was erased from even the most basic historical record. The reasoning was simple. Her grave had become a pilgrimage site for neo-Nazis and Hitler sympathizers. They left flowers, took photographs, and treated her burial place as a shrine to her brother's memory. Local authorities decided that the only solution was complete erasure. Make it impossible to find her, make it impossible to memorialize her. And so, Paula Hitler disappeared twice. Once in death and once in burial. A woman who spent her life trying to vanish finally succeeded, not through her own efforts, but through history's determination to forget her. Her life raises haunting questions. Was Paula a victim of her brother's crimes, punished for an association she never chose? Or was her studied ignorance a form of complicity? A willful blindness to horrors she must have suspected but chose not to confront. She bore no children, left no testimony, and took whatever truth she knew to an unmarked grave. The bloodline that had spawned one of history's greatest monsters had taken its first step toward extinction. But Paula wasn't the only one. The story of Adolf Hitler's family was just beginning to unfold. Angela Hitler was born in 1883, 13 years before Adolf and 14 years before Paula. She was a product of Alois Hitler's second marriage, making her Adolf's half-sister, though the two were raised together after Clara became Alois's third wife. Angela was, by all accounts, a practical, strong-willed woman who had learned early how to navigate their father's violent temper. Unlike Paula, who shrank from confrontation and sought anonymity, Angela possessed a forceful personality. She was deeply religious, a devout Catholic who attended Mass regularly and raised her children with strict moral discipline. She was also a survivor. Widowed young when her husband, civil servant Leo Raubal, died in 1910, Angela found herself raising 3 children alone, Geli, Leo Jr., and Elfriede. When Adolf's political career began to accelerate in the 1920s, Angela made a pragmatic decision. Her brother needed help managing his household, and she needed income. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement, or so it seemed. In 1928, Angela became Adolf's housekeeper, first in his Munich apartment and later at the Berghof, his sprawling mountain retreat overlooking Berchtesgaden. For a time, she was one of the very few people Hitler truly trusted, particularly among women. She oversaw his meals, managed his staff, and maintained the daily rhythm of his increasingly isolated life in the Alps. But Angela was more than just a housekeeper. She was a gatekeeper. She controlled who visited Adolf, when they could see him, and under what circumstances. She had opinions, strong ones, and she wasn't afraid to express them, at least in the early years. The rift between Angela and Adolf began with a young woman named Eva Braun. Eva was a photographer's assistant, 17 years younger than Hitler, who had met the Führer in 1929 when she was just 17 years old. By the early 1930s, she had become a regular presence in Hitler's life, visiting the Berghof frequently and clearly serving as more than just a friend or assistant. Angela despised her on sight. To Angela, a devout Catholic and stern matriarch who believed in propriety and traditional values, Eva represented everything wrong with her brother's new world. Eva was frivolous, obsessed with fashion and film stars. She loved to sunbathe, swim, and host parties. She was inappropriate, unmarried but clearly romantically involved with Adolf. And most offensively to Angela, Eva was unworthy of the great man Angela still believed her brother to be. The tension between the two women grew unbearable. Eva complained to Hitler about Angela's coldness and disapproval. Angela criticized Eva's presence and influence. Hitler, caught between his sister's iron will and his lover's emotional demands, tried to ignore the problem. But it couldn't last. In February 1936, Angela took a step that would prove unforgivable. Without asking Adolf's permission or even informing him beforehand, she married her longtime partner, architect Dr. Martin Hamitsch, in a small ceremony in Braunau am Inn, the town where Adolf had been born. The location was no accident. Braunau am Inn held symbolic significance as Hitler's birthplace, and Angela's choice to marry there without his blessing was an act of quiet defiance. She was asserting her independence, her right to live her own life separate from her brother's control. Hitler was furious. The man who dictated Germany's foreign policy, who commanded millions of soldiers, who held absolute power over life and death for millions, could not tolerate his sister's autonomy. To him, Angela's marriage wasn't a personal choice, but a betrayal, a public embarrassment, and a challenge to his authority. From that moment on, Adolf effectively erased Angela from his life. He stopped referring to her as Angela Hitler or even as his sister. In correspondence and conversation, she became only Frau Hamitsch, her married name, as though she had been severed from the Hitler bloodline entirely. In his memoirs and official records, she virtually disappeared. To the public, to history, to anyone outside his inner circle, Angela ceased to exist. The woman who had managed his household, who had known him since childhood, who had arguably been closer to him than anyone except perhaps his mother, was cast out completely. But blood, it seems, maintains some claim even on the coldest of hearts. In February 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed and Allied bombers turned German cities to rubble, Dresden was subjected to one of the most devastating firebombing campaigns in history. The city, where Angela and her family had been living, was incinerated. Tens of thousands died in the inferno. When news reached Hitler in his Berlin bunker, he did something unexpected. Despite having disowned Angela nearly a decade earlier, he ordered her evacuation. SS officers were dispatched to pull Angela and her remaining family members from the burning city and transport them to safety. They were brought to Berchtesgaden, to the very mountain home from which Angela had been exiled. It was a strange, bitter homecoming. The massive Berghof compound, once a symbol of Nazi power and prestige, was now a target for Allied bombers. The staff had fled. The opulence had faded. And Angela, the woman who had once ruled this household, returned as a refugee, dependent on the protection of the brother who had disowned her. Hitler also made financial provisions for Angela. His personal accounts show payments to her family totaling over 100,000 Reichsmarks, an extraordinary sum as the Nazi economy collapsed. His last will and testament, written in the bunker just before his suicide, included a provision for Angela, a generous pension of 1,000 Reichsmarks per month. Whether Angela ever saw any of this money after Hitler's death is unknown. The Reich's currency became worthless within weeks of Germany's surrender. Bank accounts were frozen. The elaborate financial apparatus that had supported the regime simply evaporated. But the gesture itself reveals something about Adolf Hitler that contradicts his image as a man devoid of human feeling. Even in his final days, as he prepared to kill himself and plunge Germany into permanent darkness, he thought of his sister. He provided for her. He protected her. It wasn't love, exactly. Hitler was likely incapable of love in any conventional sense. But it was connection, some vestigial recognition of family ties that even his ideology and rage couldn't completely sever. After the war, Angela vanished into the ruins of Germany. She settled in Hanover, far from the Bavarian mountains where she had spent her years managing Adolf's household. She lived simply, quietly. For a time, she ran a small business, though records don't specify what kind. Unlike Paula, who eventually broke her silence with that disturbing 1959 interview, Angela never spoke publicly about her brother. She gave no interviews to journalists or historians. She wrote no memoir. She offered no apologies, no explanations, no condemnations. But in her final years, one statement attributed to her survives. When asked about the Holocaust and the concentration camps, Angela reportedly insisted that neither she nor Adolf had known anything about mass murder. "I heard only what others heard," she claimed, echoing almost exactly the words her sister Paula would later use. Was this a coordinated response? A story the Hitler siblings had agreed upon? Or did it simply reflect a shared psychological defense mechanism, a way of coping with the unbearable weight of association with genocide? We'll never know. On October 30th, 1949, Angela Hitler Hamitsch died of a stroke at the age of 66. Her death passed quietly, noted only in local records. There were no major obituaries, no retrospectives on her life, no public reckoning with her role in history. She left no memoir, no children who bore the Hitler name, and no legacy beyond the photographs of her standing beside her infamous brother at the Berghof. Another branch of the Hitler family tree had withered and fallen, leaving behind only silence. The story of Hitler's family extends beyond his immediate siblings. Scattered across Europe and eventually America were half-brothers, nephews, and distant relatives who found themselves tethered to history's most infamous name. Some tried to exploit it for personal gain, others fled from it in horror. But all of them carried the same burden, a surname that could never be just a name. Alois Hitler Jr. was born in 1882, the product of Alois Hitler Sr.'s second marriage, making him Adolf's older half-brother. The age gap between them was substantial. Alois Jr. was 23 years older than Adolf, and the two were never close. Alois Jr. grew up under the same tyrannical father as his younger siblings, but his response to that abuse was different. He didn't withdraw or comply. He rebelled. He became restless, difficult, prone to petty crime and mischief. According to Alois Jr.'s later recollections, their father beat him savagely for his transgressions, while excusing Adolf's similar behavior as youthful cleverness. This double standard poisoned whatever relationship might have existed between the brothers. By his early 20s, Alois Jr. had had enough of Austria, enough of his family, and enough of his father's control. He left, drifting across Europe, moving from job to job, country to country, never settling, always moving. His wanderings eventually brought him to Ireland, where he met and married Bridget Dowling, an Irish woman from a respectable Dublin family. In 1911, they had a son, William Patrick Hitler. For a brief moment, it seemed Alois Jr. might settle into conventional family life, but domesticity didn't suit him. Within a few years, Alois had abandoned both Bridget and young William, returning to Germany without them. He left behind a trail of minor scandals, fraudulent schemes, unpaid debts, petty cons, and a family that would spend years trying to track him down. By the late 1930s, as Adolf Hitler consolidated his power over Germany and prepared for war, Alois Jr. was living in Berlin, running a small bakery and cafe called Café Alois, a play on his own name that showed more wit than sense. The establishment became, bizarrely, a popular hangout for SA stormtroopers, the brown-shirted thugs who had helped Hitler rise to power through street violence and intimidation. These men, loyal to the Führer, gathered at a cafe run by the Führer's half-brother, seemingly unaware or uncaring about the family connection. But if Alois Jr. thought his blood relationship would earn him special treatment or advancement, he was wrong. Adolf Hitler despised his half-brother. In Mein Kampf, Hitler's autobiographical manifesto, Alois Jr. isn't mentioned even once. The omission was deliberate and conspicuous. Hitler pretended his half-brother simply didn't exist. Alois remarried, this time bigamously, while still legally married to Bridget in Ireland. His new wife, Hedwig Heidemann, bore him a son named Heinz in 1920. But even this second family didn't bring Alois Jr. into the Nazi elite. He remained a peripheral figure, running his small cafe, living in obscurity despite bearing the most famous surname in Germany. When the war ended and Germany lay in ruins, Alois Jr. did what many Germans with problematic backgrounds did. He changed his name. He became Alois Hitler, substituting a single letter to distance himself from his infamous brother, while maintaining some semblance of his original identity. He settled in Hamburg, living quietly in the British occupation zone. The Allies, overwhelmed with processing millions of Germans, millions of claims of innocence, millions of stories of victimhood and ignorance, apparently never connected Alois Hitler of Hamburg with Alois Hitler Jr., half-brother of Adolf Hitler. Alois died of natural causes on May 20, 1956, largely forgotten by history. He was buried in Hamburg's Ohlsdorf Cemetery, one of the largest cemeteries in the world. His grave, unmarked and untended, was eventually reclaimed by nature. The plot was reassigned. Whatever marker had existed disappeared. Alois Hitler Jr. had spent his life running, from his father, from his families, from his responsibilities, and finally from his name. In the end, he achieved what he'd always sought: complete obscurity. William Patrick Hitler was born in Liverpool in 1911 to Bridget Dowling and the absent Alois Jr. He grew up in England, raised by his mother, always aware that somewhere on the continent he had an uncle whose name was becoming increasingly famous. In the early 1930s, as Hitler rose to power in Germany, young William made a calculated decision. He would go to Germany and leverage his family connection for personal gain. Surely being the Führer's nephew would open doors, create opportunities, maybe even lead to a comfortable position within the Nazi regime. He was spectacularly wrong. William arrived in Germany with high expectations and found only contempt. Adolf Hitler despised his nephew's opportunism and saw him as an embarrassment. William was half Irish, raised in Britain, and had no understanding of German culture or Nazi ideology. He was, in Hitler's eyes, exactly the kind of mongrel the Reich was supposed to eliminate. The few times William managed to meet with his uncle, Hitler berated him publicly, mocking his ambitions and questioning his motives. The relationship soured quickly. William, denied the advancement he'd expected, began to see his uncle not as a benefactor, but as the tyrant the rest of the world was beginning to recognize. In 1939, as Europe teetered on the brink of war, William Patrick Hitler made a stunning decision. He gave an explosive interview to Look magazine titled, "Why I Hate My Uncle." The article was devastating. William portrayed Adolf as petty, cruel, and unstable. He recalled visiting the Berghof and watching Hitler strike flowers with a riding crop in sudden fits of rage. He described a man obsessed with control, unable to tolerate any dissent, and surrounded by sycophants who fed his worst impulses. The interview made international headlines. Here was Hitler's own nephew, someone with intimate family knowledge, denouncing the Führer to the world. The Nazi regime was furious. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels called William a traitor and threatened consequences if he ever returned to German soil. But William never intended to return. That same year, he and his mother fled to America, seeking safety as war erupted across Europe. What William Patrick did next was extraordinary. In 1944, he enlisted in the United States Navy to fight against Nazi Germany. It was both a personal and political rejection of his uncle and everything the Third Reich represented. The US Navy was initially skeptical. They worried that Hitler's nephew might be a spy or a security risk. But after extensive background checks and interviews, they accepted him. William Patrick Hitler, nephew of Adolf Hitler, swore an oath to defend the United States and help destroy the regime his uncle had built. He served honorably as a hospital corpsman from 1944 to 1945, working in naval hospitals treating wounded servicemen. He never saw combat, but his service was real and his commitment genuine. Hitler, upon learning of his nephew's enlistment, reportedly referred to William as "my loathsome nephew," one of the few times he acknowledged William's existence at all. After the war, William Patrick made the final break. He legally changed his surname, first to Hiller, then to Stuart-Houston, completely erasing the Hitler name. It was a symbolic rebirth, an attempt to create a new identity untainted by blood. William settled in Patchogue, Long Island, a quiet suburban community far removed from the ruins of Europe. He married Phyllis Jean-Jacques, a German-American woman, and together they had 4 sons: Alexander Adolf, Louis, Howard, and Brian. Life in suburban America was deliberately ordinary. William ran a blood analysis laboratory, lived in a modest house with a white picket fence, and kept his past carefully hidden. Most of his neighbors never knew that the quiet man down the street was Adolf Hitler's nephew, that he had fought against the Nazis, that he bore the blood of history's most infamous monster. William Patrick Hitler died in 1987 at the age of 76. But his story didn't end with his death. His 4 sons remained, and their choices would prove crucial to the extinction of the Hitler bloodline. While William Patrick Hitler was denouncing his uncle to American magazines, another nephew was embracing Nazi ideology with fervent devotion. Heinz Hitler, born in 1920 to Alois Jr. and Hedwig Heidemann, represented everything the regime valued. Heinz attended an elite Napola school, institutions designed to train the next generation of Nazi leadership. He was young, athletic, Aryan in appearance, and fanatically loyal to the Führer. Some historians believe Adolf took a special interest in Heinz, perhaps seeing in him the heir he'd never had, the family member who truly understood and embraced his vision. When war broke out, Heinz eagerly enlisted in the Wehrmacht. He served as a radio operator, a role that required intelligence and technical skill. In June 1941, he was deployed to the Eastern Front as part of Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's massive invasion of the Soviet Union. The Eastern Front was hell on earth. German and Soviet forces clashed in battles of unprecedented scale and brutality. Millions died in combat, from exposure, from starvation, from the sheer inhumanity of total war. Heinz Hitler, fervent believer in Nazi victory, found himself trapped in this maelstrom. In January 1942, as German forces stalled outside Moscow, facing temperatures of -40 degrees Fahrenheit and fierce Soviet resistance, Heinz's unit was overrun. He was captured on January 10, 1942, and immediately taken to Moscow as a prisoner of war. The Soviets quickly discovered who they had captured: Adolf Hitler's nephew. It was a propaganda coup, a potentially valuable bargaining chip, and a very dangerous prisoner. Heinz was taken to Butyrka prison, one of Moscow's most notorious facilities, known for its harsh conditions and brutal interrogations. What happened to Heinz Hitler during his brief time in Soviet captivity remains murky. Some accounts suggest he was tortured for information about his uncle and the German military command. Others claim he was treated relatively well, kept alive for potential use in prisoner exchanges or propaganda broadcasts. What is certain is that Heinz died on February 21, 1942, just 6 weeks after his capture. Official Soviet records list the cause of death as tuberculosis, but given the prison's conditions and the importance of the prisoner, many historians doubt this explanation. He may have died from untreated illness. He may have been executed. He may have taken his own life. Heinz Hitler was just 21 years old. He left no children, no widow, no testimony. He was a true believer who died for an ideology that would collapse within 3 years of his death, forgotten except as a footnote to his uncle's crimes. Even after Adolf Hitler severed ties with most of his family, there was one branch he kept close, at least for a time: the Raubal side. This branch came through his beloved half-sister, Angela Hitler, who was one of the few relatives he trusted during his rise to power. Angela had 3 children with her husband, civil servant Leo Raubal Sr., Geli, Leo Jr., and Elfriede. Each of them would follow a vastly different path. Of the 3, one, Geli Raubal, would leave an indelible mark on Hitler's life. Her story entangled with his in ways that would shape his emotional world and fuel dark rumors that lingered long after her death. The others, Leo Jr. and Elfriede, would fade quietly into the shadows of history, their lives untouched by the infamy that surrounded their uncle. Among all of Hitler's relatives, none has generated more speculation, fascination, and haunting questions than Angela Maria Geli Raubal. Born in 1908, Geli was Adolf's favorite niece, and by the mid-1920s she had become something far more troubling: his obsession. In 1925, when Geli was just 17 years old, she and her mother Angela moved into Hitler's luxurious 9-room apartment on Prinzregentenplatz in Munich. Ostensibly, the arrangement was practical. Angela would serve as Hitler's housekeeper, and Geli would pursue her studies. But the reality quickly became far darker. From the moment Geli entered that apartment, her life ceased to be her own. Hitler, then in his mid-30s and ascending rapidly in German politics, began controlling every aspect of her existence. He dictated what she wore, insisting on modest dresses and no makeup. He forbade her from dating or socializing without his express permission. He monitored her correspondence and interrogated her about her activities. When Geli expressed a desire to study singing in Vienna, Hitler curtailed her plans, claiming it was unsafe for her to be so far away. When she showed interest in a young man, Hitler flew into rages, accusing her of betraying him and shaming the family. Visitors to the apartment noted the strange, suffocating atmosphere. Geli, who had been described as bright and vivacious when she first arrived, began to wilt under Hitler's control. Her smile became forced. Her laughter disappeared. She was, in every sense, a prisoner in a gilded cage. The exact nature of their relationship remains one of history's most disturbing mysteries. Some historians believe Hitler harbored incestuous desires for his niece, but that the relationship was never physically consummated. Others suggest Geli may have been coerced into intimacy. Still others argue that Hitler's control was purely psychological, an expression of his need to dominate rather than any sexual motivation. What is certain is that by 1931, Geli was desperately unhappy. She was 23 years old, trapped in an apartment with an increasingly paranoid and controlling uncle, forbidden from living a normal life, watched constantly by his staff and guards. On the morning of September 18, 1931, Hitler left Munich for a speaking engagement in Hamburg. Before departing, he had a heated argument with Geli. Witnesses reported raised voices, though the specific content of the argument was never revealed. The next morning, Geli Raubal was found dead in her room, a bullet wound through her chest. The weapon was Hitler's own Walther pistol, kept in the apartment. She was 23 years old. The official verdict was suicide. The Munich police, many of whom were already Nazi sympathizers, conducted only a cursory investigation. Geli's body was examined briefly, then released for burial. No autopsy was performed. No detailed crime scene investigation was conducted. Within days, the case was closed. But from the very beginning, rumors swirled. Some claimed Geli had been trying to escape Hitler's control and had been murdered to prevent her from exposing their relationship. Others whispered that she had been pregnant, either by Hitler or by a forbidden lover, and that suicide or murder had been used to cover the scandal. Still others suggested that members of Hitler's inner circle, concerned about the political damage Geli's potential defection could cause, had taken matters into their own hands. Perhaps they murdered her and staged it as suicide to protect the Führer's reputation. The truth died with Geli. No suicide note was found. Her final words, her final thoughts, her reasons for ending her life or the circumstances of her murder remain unknown. What is certain is that Geli's death shattered Adolf Hitler in a way few other events ever did. When news reached him in Hamburg, he reportedly locked himself in his hotel room for days, refusing food and visitors. Some accounts claim he contemplated suicide himself. He kept a portrait of Geli with him for the rest of his life. It hung in his study, in his bedroom, wherever he lived. Fresh flowers were placed before it daily, a ritual maintained even during the chaos of war. On the anniversary of her death each year, Hitler would retreat into solitary mourning, seeing no one, speaking to no one. Some historians argue that Geli's death marked a turning point in Hitler's psychology. Whatever humanity remained in him died with her. After 1931, his speeches became more violent, his policies more radical, his worldview more apocalyptic. Whether this transformation was caused by genuine grief, guilt, or simply coincided with his political radicalization is debated. Geli Raubal left no children, wrote no diary that survived, and left behind no final testimony. Her life was defined by her relationship with Adolf Hitler, and her death remains one of the most haunting mysteries of the Nazi era. She was erased from history as thoroughly as she was erased from life, remembered only as the niece who might have escaped, the girl whose story ended in blood on a Munich morning. If Geli was the niece who haunted Hitler's private world, her brother Leo Raubal Jr. was the nephew who came closest to being part of Hitler's inner circle before being swallowed by war. Born in 1906, Leo bore a striking resemblance to his uncle. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the sharp features and piercing blue eyes that Nazi propaganda celebrated as the Aryan ideal. Hitler took a particular liking to Leo, often inviting him to the Berghof for dinners and gatherings. Unlike Geli, Leo was not kept prisoner. He was welcomed, treated almost like a favored son. Dinner guests at the Berghof recalled Hitler introducing Leo as mein Neffe, my nephew, with something approaching affection in his voice. It was a rare glimpse of Hitler's capacity for familial warmth, however limited. But favoritism did not exempt Leo from duty. When war erupted in 1939, Leo was drafted into the Luftwaffe Engineering Corps. Despite his family connection, he received no special exemptions, no safe desk job away from the front. He was sent to the Eastern Front, where Hitler's ambitions were grinding millions of men into the frozen earth. By late 1942, the German Sixth Army had become trapped in Stalingrad, surrounded by Soviet forces in one of the most brutal battles in human history. The city became a frozen hell where men fought house to house, room to room, in temperatures that dropped to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Thousands died daily from combat, cold, starvation, and disease. Leo Raubal Jr. was there, serving as an engineer in the desperate German defense. In January 1943, as the pocket of German resistance shrank and supplies ran out, Leo was seriously wounded. When the remnants of the Sixth Army finally surrendered on January 31, 1943, Leo was among the 91,000 German soldiers taken prisoner by Soviet forces. Of those 91,000 prisoners, only about 6,000 would ever return home. The rest died in captivity from wounds, disease, starvation, and the brutal conditions of Soviet prison camps. Leo, however, had one advantage the others didn't. He was Adolf Hitler's nephew. When news of Leo's capture reached Hitler, he made a decision that revealed something unexpected about his character. Despite his legendary coldness, despite his willingness to sacrifice millions for his strategic goals, Hitler tried to save his nephew. He proposed a prisoner exchange through diplomatic channels. The offer was extraordinary. Leo Raubal in exchange for Yakov Djugashvili, Stalin's own son, who had been captured by German forces in 1941 and was being held in a Nazi prison camp. It was father for nephew, dictator's son for dictator's nephew, a trade that would have been politically embarrassing but personally meaningful to both men. Stalin's response was cold and final. War is war. I will not exchange a field marshal for a lieutenant. He was referring to Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, the commander who had surrendered at Stalingrad. But the message was clear. There would be no special treatment, no mercy, not even for family. Some historians interpret Stalin's refusal as pragmatic. He couldn't be seen treating his son differently from the millions of other Soviet prisoners. Others see it as deeply personal, Stalin demonstrating that ideology and the state trumped family bonds. Yakov would die in German captivity in 1943, possibly by suicide, possibly murdered. and Leo would spend the next 12 years in Soviet prison camps. Leo Raubal survived. Through 12 years of brutal captivity, through labor camps and interrogations, through disease and malnutrition, Hitler's nephew endured. It was an extraordinary feat of survival, given that only about 6% of the Stalingrad prisoners made it home. He was finally released on September 28, 1955, as part of negotiations between East and West Germany. He returned to Austria a different man, physically weakened, psychologically scarred, carrying memories he would never fully share. Leo resumed his life as a chemistry teacher and engineer in Linz, the Austrian city where Hitler had spent his youth. He married Edeltraud, a fellow schoolteacher, and they had a son, Peter, born in 1931. Leo had actually fathered Peter before the war, but raised him after his return. Leo avoided all publicity. He gave no interviews about his uncle, his time at the Berghof, his years in Soviet captivity. He simply taught chemistry, lived quietly, and tried to forget. In 1977, while on holiday in Spain, Leo Raubal Jr. died. He was 71 years old. He was buried without fanfare in Linz, far from the frozen hell of Stalingrad and the ghosts of his past. His son Peter, now an engineer himself, continued the family tradition of silence. Like so many descendants of Hitler's family, Peter never married and never had children. The Raubal branch, like all the others, was deliberately allowing itself to die out. The youngest of Angela's 3 children, Elfriede Maria Raubal, lived perhaps the most deliberately obscure life of any Hitler relative. Born in 1910, Elfriede watched as her sister Geli became enmeshed in Adolf's suffocating control and as her brother Leo was welcomed into the Führer's inner circle. But Elfriede wanted none of it. She kept her distance from the Berghof, from Nazi politics, from her uncle's world of power and violence. In 1937, she married Heinz Hochegger, a respected law professor, and settled into quiet domesticity in the Salzburg and Linz regions. There are no photographs of Elfriede at Nazi party functions. She doesn't appear in Hitler's letters or memoirs. She was never interviewed by Allied investigators after the war. She simply lived, deliberately invisible, choosing anonymity over association. During the war years, while her brother fought on the Eastern Front and her uncle directed armies across Europe, Elfriede raised her family in peaceful obscurity. She had 2 children, including a son, Heiner Hochegger, born in January 1945, just months before the Third Reich collapsed in flames. Elfriede lived a long life, passing away on September 24, 1993, at the age of 83. She died as she had lived, quietly, privately, far from the scrutiny that had consumed other members of her family. She left no memoir, gave no interviews, made no public statements about her infamous uncle. Her son Heiner continued this tradition of silence. He never married, never had children, and avoided all media contact. Like Peter Raubal, like the Stuart-Houston Brothers in America, Heiner Hochegger made the quiet decision to let his family line end with him. As of this recording, 5 men remain who carry Adolf Hitler's blood. Not his name, that was abandoned decades ago, but his genetic legacy, however diluted by generations and marriages. These 5 men represent the absolute end of the Hitler bloodline, the last chapter of a story that began in obscurity and will end the same way. In Austria live Peter Raubal and Heiner Hochegger, descendants of Hitler's half-sister Angela through her daughter Elfriede. In America live Alexander, Louis, and Brian Stuart-Houston, the surviving sons of William Patrick Hitler, Adolf's English-born nephew who fought against the Nazis. All 5 men are now in their 70s or 80s. All 5 have chosen not to have children. And when they die, the Hitler bloodline will die with them, not through force or law, but through choice. Peter Raubal was born in 1931 in Linz, Austria, the son of Leo Raubal Jr. and Edeltraud. He grew up in the shadow of history, acutely aware that his great-uncle had been Adolf Hitler, that his grandfather had been held in Nazi favor before being captured at Stalingrad. Peter became an engineer like his father, choosing a life of technical precision and professional anonymity. He worked quietly, lived privately, and avoided all attempts by journalists and historians to draw him into public discourse about his family. In the 1990s and early 2000s, Peter occasionally granted brief interviews, but he stopped even this minimal engagement after 2005. He refused to discuss his great-uncle, his family's experiences, or his own thoughts about carrying Hitler's blood. Today, Peter lives in retirement in Linz, the same city where Hitler spent his formative years. The location is both ironic and deliberate. Peter has chosen to live where his great-uncle once walked, but to live so differently that the connection becomes meaningless. He never married. He never had children. The Raubal line, which had come so close to Hitler's inner circle, ends with Peter. Even less is known about Heiner Hochegger than about Peter Raubal. Born in January 1945, during the final collapse of the Third Reich, Heiner grew up in the Salzburg region, far from the centers of power and attention. His mother, Elfriede, had successfully kept her family separate from Hitler's world during the war, and she continued this policy of deliberate obscurity after 1945. Heiner inherited her instinct for privacy. He has never given a public interview, never been photographed by the press, and never made any public statement about his family connection to Adolf Hitler. Like Peter, Heiner never married and had no children. Whatever knowledge he carries about his family, whatever stories his mother and grandmother might have told him, will die with him. He has made himself virtually invisible to history, existing only as a name in genealogical records. On the other side of the Atlantic, in a quiet neighborhood on Long Island, New York, live the three surviving Stuart-Houston brothers, Alexander, Louis, and Brian. They are the sons of William Patrick Hitler, the nephew who denounced Adolf and fought against him in the U.S. Navy. William had 4 sons with his wife Phyllis. Alexander Adolf. Yes, Adolf was his middle name, a choice William later regretted. Louis, Howard, and Brian. They grew up in Patchogue, Long Island, in a modest house behind white picket fences, surrounded by neighbors who had no idea of the history locked inside their home. The brothers attended local schools, played Little League, went to church on Sundays. They were, by all outward appearances, a normal American family. Their father ran a blood analysis laboratory. Their mother was a homemaker. They could have been any family in suburban America during the 1950s and 60s. But inside the house, the weight of their heritage was crushing. William Patrick told his sons the truth about their lineage, about their great-uncle, about the war. He impressed upon them the importance of secrecy, of never revealing who they really were. The brothers learned to live double lives. At school, with friends, in public, they were the Stuart-Houstons, unremarkable American kids. But at home, in private, they carried the knowledge that they were Adolf Hitler's great-nephews, that his blood ran through their veins. Of the 4 brothers, only Howard ever married. He wed a woman whose name has been kept private by the family, but the marriage produced no children. In 1989, Howard died in a car accident at the age of 44. His death was sudden, tragic, and removed the only Stuart-Houston who had attempted to build a conventional family life. With Howard's death, the last possibility of the Stuart-Houston line continuing through conventional family structures ended. The remaining brothers, Alexander, Louis, and Brian, had already made their choice. None would marry, none would have children. For decades, the Stuart-Houston brothers maintained absolute silence about their heritage. They refused all interview requests, avoided all media contact, and lived as anonymously as possible in their Long Island community. But in 2018, Alexander Stuart-Houston, the eldest brother and the only one who had any public presence through his landscaping business, gave a rare and brief interview to the Times of Israel. It would be the only time any of the brothers spoke publicly about their decision to end the Hitler bloodline. When asked about the legendary Hitler family pact, the story that all of Hitler's surviving relatives had agreed never to have children, Alexander laughed. "It's not a pact," he said. "That's ridiculous." But then his voice became serious. "The weight of the name. We just didn't want to pass that to anyone else." He recounted a story that revealed the true burden of their heritage. One of his brothers, he said, had become engaged to a Jewish woman. They were in love, planning a future together. But when she discovered who he was, that he was Hitler's great-nephew, the engagement ended immediately. The revelation destroyed the relationship, shattered trust, and proved what the brothers had always feared. The Hitler name, even hidden under Stuart-Houston, still had the power to destroy normal life. "How do you tell someone that?" Alexander asked. "How do you explain that you're related to the man who orchestrated the Holocaust? That your great-uncle murdered 6 million Jews? There's no conversation that survives that revelation." The legend of the Hitler family pact originated with British journalist David Gardner, who spent years in the 1990s tracking down Hitler's living relatives. Gardner claimed that the 5 surviving men, Peter, Heiner, Alexander, Louis, and Brian, had communicated with each other and reached a mutual understanding. A pact wasn't formally signed, Gardner wrote, but it was discussed among them, and it was decided that none would marry and no children would be had. Whether this formal discussion ever actually occurred is disputed. Alexander denied it in his 2018 interview, calling it a myth. But the result is undeniable. All 5 men made the same choice, whether through coordination or parallel decision-making born of shared experience. They chose to end Hitler's bloodline, not through suicide, not through forced sterilization, but through the simple act of not having children. It was a quiet extinction, a deliberate decision to ensure that Adolf Hitler's genetic legacy would die with them. Today, the 3 surviving Stuart-Houston brothers live quiet lives in their Long Island neighborhood. Alexander, now in his early 80s, has retired from his landscaping business. Louis and Brian, younger by a few years, maintain even more private existences. They live in modest homes, drive ordinary cars, and maintain minimal contact with the outside world. Neighbors describe them as polite but distant, friendly enough but clearly preferring to keep to themselves. None of the brothers use social media. None have published memoirs or given further interviews since Alexander's brief 2018 conversation. They have successfully maintained the anonymity their father sought when he changed their surname in 1947. Meanwhile, in Austria, Peter Raubal and Heiner Hochegger live similarly quiet lives. Peter, in his early 90s, rarely leaves his home in Linz. Heiner, the youngest of the 5 at 79, remains in the Salzburg region, as invisible as ever. All 5 men are aging. None have children. And when they die, whether in the next few years or the next decade, the Hitler bloodline will finally, definitively end.